Please.
Hello. General Zinni, much has been said and written about the intelligence upon which the Bush administration took our nation to war in Iraq. Supporters of this war argue the decision to go to war was made using the best intelligence estimates available at the time, and that no smoking gun exists to prove sinister intent in the process. I argue that a smoking gun does exist. It's the Office of Special Plans. This group was established in the Pentagon specifically to cherry-pick intelligence which would support the administration's premeditated decision to go to war. Sir, as best you can, please inform us to what extent the Office of Special Plans has precedent at the Pentagon, whether it was a legal entity, and whether its very existence and operation is sufficient evidence of a legal and an immoral intent on the part of the current administration in driving our nation to war in Iraq.
Could people asking questions please identify themselves and try to ask as crisp a question as possible?
I'm Frank Johnson. Well, let me answer that in two parts, because the first part had to do with the intelligence. I, of course, have been involved in this part of the world for almost 15 years. I've been part of the Central Command and involved in operations in that time. And, of course, as the Deputy Commander and the Commander of the U.S. Central Command, I followed this intelligence very closely. And it's important because, obviously, we're in a political environment and all sorts of charges are thrown back and forth, and what did we know or not know, or did everybody accept it? Let me give you my opinion, my view, my take on the intelligence as I saw it. And I saw it right up to the beginning of the war, because even though I had retired, I did some work in this area regarding Iraq, intelligence on Iraq. You have to go back to what the Security Council resolution in the United Nations directed the inspector teams to do. They inspected them to do two things, to put it simply. One was to ensure Saddam had destroyed all his weapons of mass destruction, and secondly, to ensure that he didn't have the capability to restart programs. Those were the two efforts that they were involved in. If you think back recently to Hans Blick's comments, where he was saying, well, we are not finding anything, but we're not going to give them a clean bill of health because, or recommend it, because we can't get to the scientists. We can't get them out of the country and talk to them. The necessity to talk to those scientists had to do with the second part of that mission, whether the framework was there to restart. Now, there was not full accounting for all the weapons that they had had. There were basically artillery shells, rocket rounds, things that they possessed, missiles that could be used as delivery systems or were actual weapons of mass destruction that were not accounted for. Now, over time, if you're a military person and you think about this, we don't see them. The inspectors have looked all over for them now. They have found some things and destroyed it, but basically they weren't finding much anymore. You have to believe one of two things. And a conclusion I would have come to at the end of my tour, that if they exist, and we have to assume they exist because any prudent planner is going to do that, that they're dug in, hidden somewhere. They are certainly not training with it. We would see it if they were moving them to artillery positions, to rocket battery positions, training with them and employing them. They're becoming old and obsolete and actually even dangerous to handle now. Secondly, they are tactical level weapons. Although they would present problems for our forces on the ground tactically, they are not a regional or international threat. So those kinds of weapons that were unaccounted for as time went on, as a decade and more passed, weren't as significant, but still had to be taken into account as a possibility, since we couldn't write them off. Now, the second part had to do with the framework for a program. I think it was clear that the component parts for a framework for a program were there. Doesn't mean he had a capability. It means that still in place were the scientists with their documents, that still in place were the kinds of dual-use facilities, pesticide plants, pharmaceutical plants that could be quickly converted, that he still legitimately had systems like the Al-Samud missile system that he could actually do research and development, look at how he might develop warheads, might in some way increase range. And in fact, as the inspectors went in this last time, it's seen he had been cheating and creeping up on the range. So there had to be an assumption of weapons of mass destruction there. Now, let me go back and say one other thing about the inspectors, because this needs to be clear. The inspectors don't give clean bills of health. The inspection teams have had Americans on them and others from all over the world. The inspection teams report to the Security Council. The Security Council has the say as to whether sanctions are lifted or maintained. And guess what? We're on the Security Council. As the United Kingdom, we have vetoes on that. Now, the real question about this, getting to your point more directly, is was the threat imminent? Was the threat grave and gathering? I testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee a month before the war began, in February of '03. I was asked that question directly by Senator Lugar. General Zinni, in your opinion, is the threat imminent? My answer was no, Senator. It is not. He could have weapons of mass destruction. What he may have, I believe, are leftovers. Even if he could move them out and use them, he's going to have to do it under us dominating the air, putting them on the road, storing them at battery positions. Much of what has been touted as potential delivery systems, like the unmanned aerial vehicle, was never a viable program that we monitored very closely. Even to range places like Kuwait or Jordan, he would have to move it into the no-fly zones, one of the air bases in there that he wasn't allowed to use that we would take out immediately. So to going into this, be clear. The possibility that weapons of mass destruction existed was certainly real and had to be taken into account. But the quality of those, the imminence of the threat of those, the ability to deliver those was nowhere near what I was hearing at that time. Again, in my view and what I saw in the intelligence. You know, and when I saw our Secretary of State go to the United Nations and get a 15-0 vote on Resolution 1441 and put the inspectors back in, I felt that is the right way to go. The inspectors need to be back in. Obviously, we can see a lot from our intelligence, satellites and other things, monitoring communications. We control a lot of Iraq, airspace, no drive zones. We enforce the maritime intercept operations, but there's nothing like having them on the ground. And in my mind, deploying forces in support of that diplomatic action was necessary to show we're serious. When I saw those inspectors in there getting compliance in the destruction of those missiles, those Al-Samoods that exceeded the range allowed, when I saw Hans Blix and Mohammed al-Baradei going about their business and reporting, I felt we've done what we should do. We have reestablished these sanctions in a more formidable way that we're beginning to not wane, but beginning to fall off in appreciation, not so much for those in the region that were supporting this. I didn't like the idea that I saw some of the other nations that should have been with us dropping off of this enforcement and leaving it to basically us and the Brits. Now, to go specifically to the Office of Special Plans, let me say that that organization came into existence after I retired. And I'm not directly familiar with its involvement. I had questions about some of the sources that seemed to be held in higher credibility by that organization as opposed to the CIA and other intelligence organizations, like the intelligence being given by the exiles. I felt much of the intelligence I had seen from my time in CENTCOM provided by the exiles was extremely doubtful, lacked credibility in some cases, and I questioned some of the motivations of what we were being told. And from what I saw at a distance, not being involved in this, I thought from that end there was far more credence and credibility placed on that source than was from the other intelligence agencies, and that there should have been. That's about the best I can give you because it happened after my watch.
Next question, please, and please identify yourself.
Thank you. Gabriel Kahn from Hunter College High School. You mentioned the CAP program in Vietnam, and I was wondering if you believed, first of all, that the lessons of that program could be applied in Iraq, and second of all, if they have been applied by the Army and the Marine Corps.
When I was a young second lieutenant, I was given orders to Vietnam. They were a surprise to me because every Every lieutenant in my battalion had orders to Vietnam except me, and I thought I was going to miss the war. This was 1966, and Secretary of Defense McNamara said the war will be over by Christmas, so I felt really disappointed. When I told my fiancée, now my wife, time to get married. So we got married. I was allowed, in those days, we had to ask our commanding officer permission. I did. I was allowed 4 days. We went off, honeymooned, I came back, I had my orders to Vietnam. Except I had orders not to one of the Marine divisions in Vietnam, I had orders to the Marine Advisory Unit. And they sent me to Army Special Warfare School at Fort Bragg, and I went through an intensive language training to learn Vietnamese. And I joined the Vietnamese Marine units. I wore their uniform. There were only 2 Americans to every battalion, and rarely did I see the other American. We were in an organization that was very small, that traveled all over Vietnam and operated, that because South Vietnam had a quartering act, we lived with the people. We actually moved into the houses when we were in populated areas. And I felt that we had created a relationship by doing that that really solidified the ability of our forces and their forces to work together. It wasn't so much that Second Lieutenant Zinni was providing a hell of a lot of advice to these seasoned old war horses that had fought the Indochina War, and even in one case I had a 55-year-old company commander that had fought in the Second World War, fought in the Indochina War, and now had about 8 years in this war. It was that they were teaching me things, and that I was getting a sense of the war from a different perspective. When I returned from that tour, and I talked to my counterparts who were with the U.S. units, and we talked about the war, I was describing a different war than they saw. They saw a war from totally inside a United States unit, where everybody out there that was from that culture was suspect, where everybody out there was a potential enemy, where that culture was alien. I was forced as a young 22-year-old officer to be immersed in that culture, to speak the language, to see the war from the point of view of civil society, to see the war from the point of view of soldiers that had been fighting it for 8 years, 10 years, and even more, that weren't on one-year tours and going home, to see a culture and get an appreciation for what it was, that it wasn't some sort of inferior subhuman race or culture, that it was rich and beautiful, that it was damaged, that in many ways that it was trying to struggle through this, and that in many ways that all the things we preached and thought they saw, they didn't see it that way, and they had a rationale for not seeing it that way, that in many cases they felt caught in between, that in many cases they thought we were there to do more than defeat the communists, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, that we were there to change their government, to stop the parade of generals that are holding coups in Saigon, to give them a responsive government, one they can participate in, one that would be able to meet their needs. And I came back and realized that victory is more than defeating an enemy. I also learned a lot about that culture. I saw things through a different set of eyes. I looked at this war from a different perspective. I teach courses at William & Mary College, as was mentioned. My students asked me the other day, how should we gain more information or better insights? Because one of my classes has to do with the translation of our policies through the filter of various cultures and what it comes out to sound like in the translation. And they particularly wanted to try to understand how people view things in the part of the world that we talked about tonight. And I advised them to go online to bring up the English language Arab newspapers from that part of the world, and every night read them. Read the op-ed pieces, read the reporting on the war. And then go to our sources, our print journalism, our electronic media, and listen to what we say. Listen to look at the words. You know, listen to how they describe the United States forces there, from their end and from our end. Look at how casualty reporting goes. Who reports what kind of casualties? Look at the way they take an event that occurs there and how do they report it. It isn't necessarily so that one side is right or wrong, but these are blind men feeling an elephant. Everybody has a perspective. Maybe some of it is deliberately slanted. Maybe it's just a perception you get from that part you're touching. But understand it. See it through the filter of that culture. Now, specifically to your point, the Marines created in the northern part of Vietnam these CAP platoons, civic action platoons and companies, where Vietnamese soldiers, U.S. Marines were intermingled together. The point was to live together, to try to understand each other, to get an understanding by them of us and what we were intending to do, to get our forces an understanding of their limitations, their capabilities, their insights to what was going on. It was by all measure a highly successful program. It was by all measure a much better insight for our own soldiers and Marines into the war, a different perspective. It certainly, in my time as an advisor, 1 year as an advisor, helped me when I went back for a second tour as a company commander of U.S. Marines. Because I brought, I feel, some insights and understandings that others didn't have. Things were not that crystal clear. Things had variations, had shades, had nuances that needed to be understood and taken into account and affected how we did business there. Things are not always viewed through our prism and our filter. And so I think the more we can do this, but I would say it's not one way. It's not just Americans advising Iraqis, but it might be those in the region that we know advising us. I had proposed at one point that some of the nations in this part of the world that are friendly to us, that send their officers to our schools, our command and general staff colleges and other schools, our war colleges, that we should ask them for 5 or 6 officers for each of our battalions and brigades. They know us, they speak English, they've been to our courses, they operate with us. They certainly know their own environment. And they would be put as advisors or planners. They would be put into our units and our staffs so that when our commanders on the ground confront a situation, that kind of advice at least can be provided, that kind of insight, that communication, that translation of actions can be given. What do we have instead? We have a number of translators on the ground. Who are they? Arab American students that we've sent over there, soldiers and Marines that we've trained in language that maybe speak the wrong dialect, that certainly don't have the cultural sensitivities and understanding. But these are the kinds of creative things we need to do in this environment. You can't put U.S. troops locked in a U.S. environment, throw them in the midst of this, confronted with situations they don't understand, which culturally are very different than what they've faced. I've been through that. I've been through that for 40 years, from Vietnam to Somalia to northern Iraq to the Balkans to everywhere else in the world that we've gone in and have had to deal with these cultures. In the 40 years I was in the military, my country sent me to 70 different countries, to do something. And believe me, when you look at the situation from the eyes of somebody else, when you at least have the ability to understand you need to do that, you're going to be much better in the decisions you make.
General Zinni, my name is Steve Brandt. I'm a member of the Foreign Policy Association. I really appreciate the honesty of your answers. A little long, but very honest. My Jon Stewart imitation. Regarding the actions of Paul Bremer, because you talked about the need for what's happening over there to be legitimate, he recently admitted that he wanted us to have more troops on the ground. Yet Aaron Brown on CNN last night strung together some wonderful clips of all the times when Paul Bremer publicly said he was not asking for more troops. Yet he apparently was. So on the question of holding us responsible for doing the right thing, that dichotomy of what he was really doing and what he was saying he was doing, plus it was reported in the New York Times that the last day he was in control, he signed some documents that exempted all U.S. corporations from any lawsuit from the Iraqi government. He had that power to put in place laws, and so all of our companies over there are free to do whatever and can never be accused by the Iraqi government, challenged in their courts. So could you comment on whether that really puts us in the right light, that law that Bremer put in place, and this whole paradox of he wanted more troops, but he wouldn't admit it publicly that he wanted more troops, so his superiors were never held accountable on the troop question? Thanks very much.
Kind of a long question, but I'll try and answer. Look, first of all, let me say that I think our country owes a lot to Jerry Bremer. He was thrown into this situation. He wasn't involved in the planning. It was a last-minute decision, and to be thrown into the conflict right in the middle of it is a difficult situation. Having said that, I think there were flaws in the whole process of preparing for the aftermath. There was insufficient planning, clearly. There was sort of a rosy outlook, maybe given to us by the exiles or encouraged by them as to, flowers in the street and to be welcome. So the assumptions you would use in planning, the worst case situations, or at least look toward the possibilities that would require more forces, like the need for security, chaos. Let me give you a simple view of this thing. You're about to go into a country, you're about to take an authoritarian dictator down, a ruthless government that controls everything, and rip it out. Now, when you do that, you create a void and a vacuum. You create a void and a vacuum in a country that has, as I said before, these fissure points and these natural fault lines. You should make some accountability for having to deal with that and to provide and to fill the vacuum that's going to be needed in terms of security and in terms of order. Now, I think there were a number of bad decisions made. I think that they were too slow and ineffective in economic development. As I mentioned before, the convergence of the things needed early on. I think we had insufficient troops. Like I said, the plan that I inherited and the plan that I promoted and developed in my time there had a hell of a lot more troops. Rick Shinseki knew that. He certainly provided the Army forces for that, too. We understood what we were going to need, not to defeat the Republican Guard, but to manage the aftermath. We actually had a plan at CENTCOM for managing the aftermath, which somehow disappeared and wasn't taken into account. The decision to disband the Army mystified me, because going back before me to my predecessors, we had an ongoing psychological operations program to communicate to the regular Iraqi Army, and basically our messages delivered in the form of quiet communications and also through leaflets that we dropped over them and everything else saying, when the time comes, if you don't fight, we'll take care of you. I don't know what happened. The corporate memory was gone. And suddenly we disband them after sort of creating that belief. And they would have been the source, obviously, with removing the leadership and those responsible for unacceptable acts. In addition to that, there was too much faith placed in the exiles. They were allowed to convince him to de-Ba'athify too deeply. I mean, I was involved in part with our communications with the Soviet Union right after the wall came down. And we began to interact with them to help them move toward democracy. And what I saw was necessary at some places, at some levels, to keep people in place that knew what was going on, that knew how to make things function, that didn't have blood on their hands. They weren't part of the hard part of the Communist Party, but they were communists, and they had to be, hopefully reforming. But they were necessary in the beginning. So the de-Ba'athification came very quickly, and I think removed some capability and created distrust, especially amongst the Sunni. I think that we underestimated the tasks we had in there, that we didn't understand that the political, the economic, the security tasks that we were going to be required to do in there, the rebuilding of the infrastructure, the construction, the reconstruction was so great. Think about this. The CPA, I believe they were looking for 144 people and I don't even want to use the term reconstruct, to construct a country, because it had no history of the kinds of things we wanted to put in there. That 144 people, scraped from different embassies, some unwilling from around the world, a pickup team, with a quarterback thrown in the third quarter, without a game plan. And we see the results of what happened. There were insufficient military forces in there in the beginning. The borders were porous. The infrastructure wasn't guarded. We didn't act swiftly to take care of problems that were starting to rise up. We didn't make crystal clear decisions like, should militias be allowed? The Kurds have their Peshmerga. The Shia have their Sadr and Sistani. The exiles had their own militias. Ahmed Shalabi's running around with his own militias. How were they accounted for? Who was allowed to have militias? What was the status of those militias? By letting that go unanswered, we created and allowed problems to develop that we had to deal with later. And so ad hoc organizations, lack of planning, lack of understanding of the culture, having a depth of understanding of the problem leads you to those kinds of decisions that now we're looking back on and saying, shoulda, coulda. short enough.
Two more questions, please.
Hi, General. My name is Jim Crotty, and I'm author of How to Talk American. And I am struck by how prominent Vietnam has become in discussions of Iraq. And my question is about the analogies between Iraq and Vietnam. In 1968, we had a choice, perhaps, to leave Vietnam. And you're talking about now of the United States staying in Iraq 5 to 10 more years. Well, from 1968 until the time we left Vietnam, thousands of more people died. It's one of the things that is upsetting in discussions of war, that we don't talk about the thousands of people that die, the people that are permanently maimed. Those things aren't discussed. We abstract ourselves from that fact. And I think that really needs to be brought to bear, that 5 to 10 years from now in Iraq, there may be thousands and thousands of more American soldiers dead, tens of thousands of Iraqis dead. And so my question is this. Vietnam in 2004 is now a relatively free country. If we leave, yes, cut and run in Iraq, why is that not an option when it really, at the end of the day, could have been an option with Vietnam?
I think Vietnam, basically, although obviously you had the communists and the South Vietnam and North Vietnam divisions, basically, with some small groups, obviously the Montagnards and others, you basically had a homogeneous society. You basically had people that understood, knew each other, that had common ground much more deeply. It was not a nation that was created out of scratch, that didn't have any history in terms of richness or background in its recent past. You had in Vietnam at the time people that were caught in between. I don't think they fully understood, the average villager understood the difference in the fighting. The promises were out there, but they were vague, and there was no real understanding of that. Let me give you a different view of Vietnam from the time you mentioned, 1968 on. And by the way, I was shot in 1970, so believe me, I talk about those events. In 1968, we actually had a moment. Giap failed in the Tet Offensive. He not only failed in the Tet Offensive, he destroyed the Viet Cong. He pushed them into it as the cannon fodder. And there was a strong, strong resentment on their part. There was a real break in the ranks. There was a moment there where they felt they were defeated. Unfortunately, popular support, the way we handled the war, the way we talked about it, we were defeated in terms of public will, probably had turned the corner at that point. We elected to go to Vietnamization. Now I want to take you to the Easter Offensive of 1973, when basically we were into Vietnamization now. The Vietnamese stood up to the North Vietnamese and defeated them in the Easter Offensive. Unfortunately, our Congress pulled the plug on funding them. So when the second assault came, they were unable to stand up to them. So what we had built there in that time was the ability for them to succeed. We certainly lost interest, left. I think there was a realization that the basic strategy going in, the domino theory, wasn't viable, and we left them to their own devices without the wherewithal to stand up. But remarkably, painfully, we created the capability to stand up. That onslaught would have continued, I'm sure, long after that. Had we pulled out, let's say 1968, we would have cut and run, in your words. I think there would have been a slaughter in South Vietnam. I think it would have been much different had the North Vietnamese not had suffered the Easter Offensive and gone through what they had gone through. Plus, Vietnam was isolated. The basic strategic flaw that Thailand and Burma and all the countries in Southeast Asia would fall in these dominoes did not prove to be true. However, in this part of the world, that will be true. You will transplant an Afghanistan-like environment right into the heart of the Middle East. You will create new theocracies in some parts of this that will spread its movement into the Shia parts of some of the countries in the Gulf. You will create sanctuaries and pits that the al-Qaedas and al-Qaeda wannabes can operate out of. You will create political problems, Kurds declaring independence and the stress and pressure that may bring in relationship with Kurds, Iranians, and others. You will leave there a pot that will tempt hegemons like Iran to get involved in it. You will create additional problems for elsewhere in that region where we have interests. What its effect may be in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which we are woefully absent in our involvement, unfortunately. You will break relationships in the region. You will pressure countries in that region not to associate and relate with us. And let me give you some of the practical. I know people don't want to hear this, but 25% of our energy comes from that part of the world, too. You'll threaten the basic material concern we have in terms of our interests. That shouldn't be the rationale, and that wasn't the mission that I was given, but it was certainly part of it in that part of the world. Vietnam didn't have that potential. Somalia didn't have that potential. Beirut didn't. So all the places that we left and had the option, this one I don't believe in my heart of hearts we have the option right now. I also think we are not going to see thousands and thousands of soldiers die. I think there will be continued casualties. I think it's going to take a couple of years to get the Iraqi forces to stand up. But the pivotal point is, I'm going to go back to my point about you're creating an army before you're creating a state. When the state is in place and the army is motivated to fight for the state and has a stake in the state, then you will have succeeded. It's more than just training and equipment. You have to get to that point. Again, going back to Vietnam, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam was not capable until 1973 to stand up to the assault, and might have been capable further on. And so if we cut and run now, we are ceding this. But we are not ceding this to a North Vietnam. We are not ceding this to some sort of order, however distasteful. We're ceding it to disorder and chaos, which will spread. To me, that is important in this part of the region and the rationale not to cut and run.
Last question, please.
Thank you. My name is Cynthia Roberts. I'm a professor of political science here at Hunter. I'm tempted, General, to ask a follow-up question on the Vietnam one related to, once again, why our generals have not spoken out against, at an earlier time, a flawed political strategy as they did not in Vietnam. But instead, I'm going to ask a more important question because I think I already know the answer to that one. And the more important question is this. As commander of CENTCOM, you clearly were familiar, indeed intricately involved in the regional politics, in the regional dynamics. You successfully built coalitions. You successfully helped to maintain a containment strategy that was working, and as you've many times pointed out, continued to work before the onset of this war against Iraq. So I'm rather surprised to hear in your talk an analogy to the post-World War II period, where we set up NATO and a strategy to deal with what was then the Soviet communist threat. And the reason I'm surprised and would like to press you further is this. As you well know, the enemy was clear. Our political and military strategy was integrated. Our friends were our allies, and while some needed bolstering, we knew who our friends were and who our enemies were. When we look at the Middle East today, the situation, as you hinted at, is much more complicated. Our political and military strategy is complicated, riddled with contradictions, and full of disjunctures. Our threats are also our allies.
Please ask your question.
Our threats being from these regimes like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, also our allies because of oil and strategic interests. So my question to you is, why would you suggest a strategy like the one that we successfully put in place after World War II for a region where it's clearly not going to work, and have you a different suggestion that might be more viable?
I think I said that, like we did after World War II, the objective of the strategy after World War II, Marshall and Truman, was to change the conditions. Now, what did we have? We had the evils of colonialism, of empire, of militarism. These societies needed to change their economic systems, their political systems, their security systems. Now, I grant you that in this region of the world, the problems are different, and I will grant you more complex. But I would tell you that it isn't enough to go around like we're stamping out ants to each problem and deal with it individually. They're connected. The Middle East peace process, the war, the so-called war on terrorism, the Iraq situation, Iran, Afghanistan, our relationships with Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the countries you mentioned, the need for reform out there. These are all interrelated problems, some of which they've got to handle, but some of which, if we go back to Wilson's problem and we just reject them and isolate ourselves, will wash up on our shores. They already have in this city. You know, look at how we approach this. We have declared war on terrorism. Does that strike you as funny? The terrorism is a tactic. It is a tactic. We've declared war on nations. We've declared war on ideologies. We have just declared war on a tactic. It is the conduct of violence against innocents. How do if you can't even define what you're fighting, you have a problem. The tactic is the center of gravity at that level for the bad guys, for the Osama bin Ladens and the Zarqawis of the world. That's what they use. But they also need, at a strategic level, angry young men that are willing to blow themselves up. And they're angry for some sort of political, economic, or social reason. They need an aberrant form of Islam as a means of justification and to rally the cause. What are we doing about those levels? If you declare war on terrorism, you stay focused on killing a bunch of bad guys in Afghanistan, breaking down cells in 60 countries through law enforcement cooperation, cutting off finances. But what are you doing if you're affecting the organization at a tactical level, but it has now transformed itself into an ideology that's growing stronger because at its strategic level, it still brings in those angry young men because the causes of those anger is not adjusted, not addressed. And what I thought for using that example is not a direct correlation, but it is the principle of changing conditions, going to the strategic center of gravity and saying we need to deal in a cooperative way with eliminating what brings the anger. You know, some young man is willing to blow himself up in a car and some ridiculous objective to drive to a checkpoint that maybe kills some innocent people trying to shop or stand in line to get a job. What is it that makes that happen? It is a complicated, complex question. But if you don't go after that and you don't attempt to deal with it, you don't attempt to get international and regional cooperation to deal with it, you're doomed to repeat that car bombing. That's my point. It's not that it is a direct correlation to what we did in reconstructing Europe, Southeast Asia. It is the principle of changing the conditions.
How about a short question?
General Zinni, thank you very much. We've kept you substantially over the time. We're sorry we can't address any more questions because we're way over the time. Thank you all very much.